How you doing today? I am David Long, here to talk to you about truth, epistemology. We're going to sit down, we're going to draw some graphs, and we're going to talk about some interesting stuff. Let's talk real briefly today about truth. So I'm going to draw a little truth graph. It's going to try to explain different types of truths. Have you ever noticed that different people speak about truth differently or have different conceptions about truth? Like, especially in America, it seems like we live in the type of society who thinks that, my opinion is just as good as your opinion because we're both people, so we both have our truth, like my truth or your truth. And of course, nobody can tell us that our personal experience is not true because we lived it and we know that it's true. But at the same time, someone else might say, well, we have objective measurements, and the whole idea behind science is to take out the subjective elements of personal experience so we can get at an actual measurable thing that would be true for everybody, no matter who had a certain experience with a certain thing. So there are different types of truths. There are things we know are true, and there are things we know are not true. So these are what we call facts. And how do we know? Well, we know some things are true based on evidence. And the things that we know are not true, they've been proven wrong, also based on evidence, right? And then there are things that are unknown. How are they unknown? Well, we don't have enough evidence yet. We can't be proven because we haven't gathered enough data, and so it's still questionable. And then there are things that are unknowable. So these are things that we have not yet measured. And these are things that are unmeasurable. All this has to do with different measurements, right? And so down here we have mystery. So when we talk about these things on this side, things that we know are true and things that we're still trying to figure out, things that we're still measuring, we usually talk about that in very scientific, logical types of language. Yes, this is how I attempt to write. And we call that day language, with a little bit of a tip of the hat to Michael Dowd for coming up with that term, in contrast to what we would call night language, which has to do more with symbols and myths and poetry. So an example on this side, there could be poetic things that we know are not true, not literally true, embedded in symbols and myths and poetry. For example, like the tortoise and the hare. This is a story that is a myth, not about true events, about a tortoise and a hare and a race or any of that, but about poetically meaningful things that relate to our personal experiences, like striving and driving and patience, and how over time will lead to something good and you will win the race more so than cockiness and arrogance. That's what the story of the tortoise and the hare are about. Now, there are also religious poetic things, trying to get at the ultimate mystery of everything. These stories about things that are unknowable, maybe they're not actually, factually getting at the truth of the universe, but stories about Vishnu's dream or Jesus on the cross, if looked at through a more poetic, symbolic kind of lens, could get at the mystery of what it is to be in a larger context, poetry about oneness and self-sacrifice, and these are symbols that will get you in touch with the mystery of reality and get you to think about yourself in relation to your society in ways that are general, factual, practical kind of ways will not necessarily do. Let's talk about other kinds of truth real quick. I don't know if you're familiar with integral theory, but in integral theory we talk about interiors and exteriors to every being. There's an in and an out, as well as individuals and collectives. So let's see, these are the interiors, and these are the exteriors, and these are the individuals, and these are the collectives. That's a 1 and a 0. So in terms of different types of truth, there is an interior, individual type of truth that is called subjective truth. And we speak about this in I language. It's first person language. We say, I felt this, I think this, I like this, or that upset me. You know what I mean? Now, if something upsets you, that is your subjective truth. That is a true fact for you. You were upset. That is a feeling you had. That's assuming that you're representing your interiors in an honest and an authentic way. That would be the test of subjective truth. Now, on the other side, the individual exterior, what we call the it domain, third person, here we have the objective truth. And that are these facts that we're talking about up here, the types of evidence. In a sense, you could think of this quadratic chart fitting inside this upper chart. And similarly, you might find, if you explored it further, other quadratic charts that could fit within each of these charts. But we won't get into that today. So here we have, let's go back to that upset me. You know what I mean? Let's say you're a Christian and somebody brings up, the truth, the objective, factually proven, demonstrated, measured through multiple disciplines, truth of evolution. Them being upset might be their truth, but the measurable facts is the third person objective truth. These are different types of truths. So the next type of truth is what we're going to call, this is the we dimension. This is truths based on agreement, and this is second person, and this is relative truth. That's probably not how you spell relative truth. Okay, relative truth. Relative truth has to do with meaning. So let me put this over here. We have facts. We have, I want to say feelings and thoughts. A feeling is a thought, and a thought might be a feeling. You can tell from my writing that, you can be really good at philosophy but not so good at the spelling. So here you have facts, feelings, here you have meaning. A great example of this is right now I'm speaking to you in English. So this is a type of relative truth. If you're listening right now and you don't speak English, you're probably wondering, what the heck is this guy talking about? His drawings are bad and I can't understand what he means. But the other problem with this is we express truth in all of these quadrants in relative terms, right? Because even when we're saying, my stomach hurts or whatever, those are words in English. The feeling or the thought, when it's expressed, is expressed through this relative filter of meaning. Even statements about measurements and facts are written in words or inches. So even if you have facts, objective facts, we still talk about those objective facts and those subjective, feelings in relative terms. That's why a lot of people say everything is relative. And relative doesn't mean like, oh, it's all whatever. It means like related to. So that goes back to the objective truth. This measurement is true relative to the agreements on the symbol sets that I've used to express it. For example, 2 plus 2 is 4. That is an objective, factual statement, but the only way we can get to it are through the relative symbol sets, the symbol of 2 and 4 and plus and equals. All of those things are relative symbols that hold meaning. But not everything is the filter or symbol sets through which we communicate it. We can still make distinctions of I and it. But knowing this filter is there is certainly important. So let's take a second real quick and talk about how these three aspects interact with each other. On one side, on our interiors, we have our subjective experience. And on the other side, there's objective reality. And there's a circle that happens. And in the middle, there's a relative filter of culturally constructed meanings, values, and symbols. We have our subjective experience, and everything that we know has been communicated to us by some person in the objective reality. So we get, coming this way, sense information in the form of sounds and, vibrations on your eardrum, colors. You watch a movie, you see things, you hear things. That's all sense information. It shapes your perspective, and it expands your perspective. And you have this expression and projection which defines your experience. So we have incredibly limited perspectives, and everything that we know is based on our experience of the objective reality, which in a sense has already been predefined based on what we had previously known. So we're always experiencing any new situation in the light of what we had already understood and what had already been communicated to us by people in our culture. And this is called the Hermeneutic Circle of meaning. Everything we know is based on our experiences of the external environment or reality. You exist in a limited context of time and space, so we have an incredibly limited perspective. Any new experiences run through the filter of our personal concepts and emotions in any given moment. This means that our perspective is clouded by our limited concepts of reality and the emotions associated with them. Personal experience is not that trustworthy. People everywhere deceive themselves into believing all kinds of crazy things, and that does not make them true or reliable. We are really easily deceived, and that's the main reason that we must be skeptical and use the scientific method to know what's true. Probably the most important part of the scientific method is the peer review process and the reproducibility of the results and tests. We as animals look for patterns as a way of survival. Animals make two types of mistakes when it comes to these patterns. They fail to detect patterns where there are patterns, and they see a pattern where there are none. The second is called superstition. Tests have been done on pigeons by B.F. Skinner in the 60s where they're given a treat for pecking a key in its cage. And then later the machines were set to reward the birds at random. What happened is that most of the birds developed superstitious behaviors. Like a bird would look over his shoulder and the reward mechanism randomly would give it a treat. And the bird associated looking over his left shoulder with the reward. So it tries again, and out of random chance, the reward mechanism gives it a treat. The bird is confirmed in its superstition by its personal experience and then becomes a maniac for looking over the left shoulder. And this is not a valid way to find out what's true. It's called confirmation bias. If it sometimes doesn't work, then we also have to wonder why and keep track of the times it failed as well. The last type of truth that we're going to talk about is the its domain, the plural exterior. Now this is where it's going to get a little bit dicey. This is a systems approach, but I'm going to say if you go big enough, it could even be a big picture objective or even absolute. This is third person as well. This is the biggest perspective you can take. Big picture objective or absolute is unmeasurable. It fits down into these two bottom categories. You know what I mean? In some sense, you could say that these two categories about mystery, things that are unknown because we haven't totally measured them, and so they're a mystery. That's still trying to understand things in terms of evidence, and things that are unknowable that maybe we could try to understand in terms of symbol or myth or poetry to try to get at some kind of metaphorical truth about the significance of reality. None of that can hold the actual big picture, objective, or absolute truth because it's always going to be spoken about in relative terms. So in a sense, everything we say and understand is ran through this relative filter. Maybe the thing to put here would be, I'm going to say systems on the big picture objective side, because we are starting to have some theories and we can understand some aspects about the big picture domains, even though there are some things that are still unknown. We can't measure every single factor in every single system in every single environment, so we can't with 100% predictability be able to explain everything. It's just impossible. We don't have enough evidence, we haven't measured enough things, so we can't really understand it in big picture objective terms, but we do have some vague systems theories. Now on the realm of the absolute, we can only speak about it in terms of poetry. So this is where I want to put mystery again. In terms of the absolute, truth of everything in relation to the relative truth of our local, poetic, humanly constructed, culturally created way of talking about it. Like, think about how we can't express even 2 plus 2 is 4, and actually get at the true objective fact of 2 without using this like relative lens to put things through. If it can't even hold, the truth of this pen in my hand, how can our language even begin to hold the absolute truth of reality and the universe? So these are kind of the different types of truth that people talk about. They talk about the absolute truth, which is unknowable and unspeakable. Okay, and part of unknowable is also probably unmeasurable. But that doesn't stop people from making sort of broad, vague, absolute claims. Like, the general kind of claims you hear are that in an absolute sense, everything is perfect or everything is one, where in a relative sense, we're individuals in a context and there are problems, little relative problems. And this makes sense if you think about the different scales on which things happen. For example, evolution in itself is a working system, though the individual participants within evolution might find it problematic. On the big picture objective side, we're starting to develop theories. Now, a theory isn't just like I'd like to think that it's like this. No, it is a collection of facts through multiple disciplines that are tested over and over and over, that come together as a collection of what we understand thus far, that we're working to refine and understand better. So, in some sense, what I've done here is I've dealt with both an idealistic and materialistic interpretation of the big picture, which I know might be a little bit confusing. Idealists tend to think that all of reality is ideas in the mind of God, or this, that there was this like being before everything that created everything, whereas materialists tend to think that the universe is infinite. So they're both going to talk about the big picture objective truth in a more materialistic third-person sense, right? Or people's personal experiences or thoughts and feelings on the absolutes in the absolute sense, and their failure to be able to express it in relative terms. Idealists might want to put the absolute dimension in the upper left subjective quadrant because that's where their experience of the absolute is, this mystery from their limited perspective. And also a lot of idealists think that the upper left quadrant is primary, like consciousness existed before the Big Bang, in their view. But that would be reducing the absolute to just the individual interior, which is pretty narcissistic if you think about it. Really, in a strict sense, you would want to draw a circle around all of this quadrants and say that it's all the absolute. And all of the truth claims from each of the individual quadrants are ran through a filter that is relative. One thing we often say is that the map is not the territory, or that our words for what's going on are not the thing in itself. But it seems like the lower right quadrant does include all the other quadrants because it's a systems theory and big picture theory quadrant. Just to make that clear. I wanted to explain that both of them are incredibly limited approaches to the big picture objective or the absolute, and how they both also have things to bring to the table in terms of, be it theories to better understand how we as individuals and cultures relate to the big picture environment, but also as personal experiences that broaden and expand our perspective, so that way we can poetically and metaphorically have higher levels of meaning and metaphor to be able to poetically wrap our minds around the mystery of reality in a practical way, where we can still make distinctions between what's subjective and what's objective, what's relative, and the big picture objective and the absolute, and as well as a process for how we can know things in the real world as an epistemology. What kind of language are we talking? Are we talking a logical, scientific, third-person language? Or are we talking a poetic, metaphorical, mystery language that's poetic to get us to think and feel differently about how we relate to the world? Are we speaking about our personal opinions and feelings? Are we talking about what's agreed upon within a culture? When we're speaking about truth, what kind of truth are we talking about? Are we talking about subjective truth? Are we talking about objective truth? Are we talking about relative truth? Are we talking about the big picture objective? Or are we talking about some systems theory? Are we talking about the absolute truth of reality? And how can we back that up with evidence? Okay, now let's check out this graph. This has to do with what counts as evidence. For example, a lot of religious people will say that their religious experiences are good evidence of God or some truth about the cosmos or something like that. So in the upper left, you have someone's intention, their consciousness, known by their felt experience. Now you may know what you felt, and that is a type of fact, as we've already said. But let's say if you're doing meditation or something, no amount of looking at the inside of your mind is going to be able to tell you truths about the external reality. If you go to the upper right, you have behavior, objective realities of all beings at all levels of organization. And it's known by measurement. Or this could just be tangible facts. 1 + 1 is 2. That's how you know objective things. In the lower left, it says it's culture, known by mutual resonance, intersubjective realities of all beings of all levels of communion. So how do we know what people feel or what the meaning of something is? We ask a bunch of people, and that's a type of truth too. It's not the whole truth, it's a type of relative cultural meaning of truth. Then in the lower right, you have systems theory, known by systemic analysis, interobjective realities of all beings at all levels of intersection. So for example, the kinds of reasons that you have for idealistic metaphysical claims are going to be based on upper left quadrant felt experiences, and through lower left traditional dogma and indoctrination, cultural conditioning. And the way that we know that consciousness is a byproduct of matter is known by systemic analysis. So in a sense, you have idealism making claims about the ultimate truth of reality based on cultural meanings and felt experiences. And you have materialism, which is known through objective measurement and systemic analysis. I would tell you, idealism is qualifying the unqualifiable, making claims about things that are beyond anyone's ability to make claims about. Whereas, to some extent, materialism is a relative fact. It doesn't get at the ultimate truth of everything, and it can't be reduced to mere empiricism, but we can know, based on the cosmology that we already have, that consciousness is a byproduct of matter, not the source of matter. So, depending on what kind of claim you're making, you have to look at the relative quadrant to get the data. So, for example, taking a vote is not a way to get at the objective truth. Looking at your still mind is not a way to know the truth about cosmology. And measuring someone's brain waves is not a good way to know what their felt experience is like. So all of these disciplines have to be qualified in their own quadrants. I hope this has been a good explanation of different types of truth and how we can know things. Remember when I said that if you tried to, you could probably find quadrants within these quadrants? Well, check this out. One more graph I want to show you before we go has to do with what's called Integral Methodological Pluralism, which is a fun thing to say, but what it basically means is that each of these quadrants, the I, the we, the it, and the its, as we've been talking about, they have different approaches to different kinds of truth. So the idea behind the integral methodological pluralism is to take into account all of these different methods of getting at different types of truths. And what it does is it says that there's an inside and an outside within each of these quadrants. Like, for example, I can think about my thoughts and like what it feels like for me to experience my thoughts versus what it is to think about thinking. So that's a third person way of thinking about a first person. So the inside is a first person on a first person, and the outside is a third person on a first person. And the same thing in these other things. I can think about what it's like to be inside of a culture in my own experience, and I can think about what it's like to be in a culture in a third-person experience from the outside. So thinking about all of these perspectives from the inside of them and from the outside of them. And these produce different types of disciplines. Like a first-person perspective on a first-person type of way of thinking about things is phenomenology, whereas a third-person way of looking at a first-person perspective is called structuralism. All of these are different approaches to truth, and the idea is to include them all, but to realize that none of them are the big picture, none of them are getting at all of it, and that to really understand the big picture is to understand all of these different ways of trying to understand aspects of the truth. I just thought I would leave you with something like that to think about what it would be like to have the most inclusive perspective possible and to be able to understand different types of truth and how we can get at them within each system. You know, I'm reminded of a quote by Oscar Wilde who once said, "The pure and simple truth is never pure and rarely simple." I think that we have learned that today. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope to see you again soon. Peace.